Okay, here we go. Today we're talking about properties of numbers. The first thing we're going to do is talk about what is an inverse. Basically, when you see the word inverse, you want to think edit, undo. Okay, it is all about undoing an operation. So what operation undoes another operation? Examples, if you add 2, what operation undoes that? Subtract 2. Okay, if you have 5 and you add 2 to that, you get 7. How do you get back to 5? You subtract 2. Okay, or if you multiply by 2, what operation undoes that? Dividing by 2. So that is what an inverse is. So what is an additive inverse? Basically, an additive inverse is the opposite. Okay, find the additive inverse of 3. The opposite of 3 is negative 3. Find the additive inverse of negative 1/2. The opposite of negative 1/2 is positive 1/2. Okay, that's what an additive inverse is, and how it's basically undoing the operation. So, what is an additive identity? An identity, that is something, the additive identity is if you take a number and add it to its inverse, what do you get? Alright, so we know, let's see here, the inverse of 3 is negative 3. So if we do 3 plus negative 3, what do we get? 0. That 0, that is called the additive identity. Okay, so 0 is the additive identity. That's because if you take a number and add it with itself, you get 0. So that is the first part. The next part we're looking at is multiplicative inverse. All right, so think, what is the opposite of multiplying by something? Dividing by it. Now, instead of dividing, what we look at is the reciprocal. All right, so the multiplicative inverse is the reciprocal. Okay, and what a reciprocal is basically flip it. So if you have 3, the reciprocal of that is 1/3. All right, so the multiplicative inverse of 3 is 1/3, because basically a fraction is dividing. Okay, so that's why it's the opposite. Now the multiplicative inverse of negative 1/2, when you flip 1/2 over, that becomes 2/1, which is just 2. So the multiplicative inverse of negative 1/2 is negative 2. All right, so basically you just flip it. And if this were, say, 2, negative 2, the opposite would be the negative 1/2, because you think, okay, when we did it up here with a 3, that'd be 3/1. When you flip that, that's 1/3. Okay, so that is what multiplicative inverses are. Now the multiplicative identity, because we're multiplying, we're going to take an inverse, or a number, multiply it by its inverse. Well, what is 3 times 1/3? Well, if you look at this and you reduce, 3 goes into 3 once, 3 goes into 3 once, you end up with 1. 1 is your multiplicative identity. Okay, because if you take a number and multiply by its inverse, you get 1. Now the other side of looking at an identity is, what can you multiply every number by and it doesn't change? Okay, for example, what I mean is if you take 3, multiply it by 1, you still get 3. That was the same thing with the additive identity. Okay, with the additive identity, if we take a number and add 0 to it, we get that same number. It doesn't change. It keeps the number the same, like an identity. It keeps it the same. So there's your additive identity. Multiplicative identity, if you multiply any number by 1, you get that same number out. You just get 3. That's what an identity is. Okay, so your multiplicative identity is 1. The multiplicative property of 0, if you multiply anything by 0, what do you get? 0. That's just the simplest way of saying anything you multiply by 0, you get 0. Okay. Now, looking at a couple properties, the commutative and the associative properties. First thing I want to talk about is the commutative. Commutative is basically switching places. If you take 2 plus 3, you get 5. Well, if you take 3 plus 2, you also get 5. So it doesn't matter which order you multiply it in. Okay, that's saying 2 plus 3 equals 3 plus 2. Commutative property will work with addition and with multiplication. If we do 2 times 3, that is 6. If you do 3 times 2, that is also 6. So 2 times 3 equals 3 times 2. Commutative, you can switch the order. Okay? Associative is how you associate things. So for example, if we do 2 plus 3 and then add 4 to that, is that the same thing as saying, okay, let's do our 3 plus 4 first and then add 2 to that? Is that the same thing? Well, 2 plus 3 is 5, and then when we add 4, we get 9. On this side, 3 plus 4 is 7, and when we add 2, we get 9. So 9 equals 9. Yes, it is the same thing. Okay, so it's how you associate things in which order. Again, this also works with multiplication. So commutative and associative only work for addition and multiplication. Okay, they will not work for subtraction or division. Okay, that is it. Now, the next page, I'm going to look at a couple examples, and then you will have your you-try problems that we'll go over in class tomorrow. So, 1/4 times x equals 1. What does x equal? Well, that's saying you're going to get the identity when you multiply, so you want the reciprocal, or the multiplicative inverse of 1/4, which is the reciprocal. What's the reciprocal of 1/4? 4. All right, so x equals 4, and name the property. That is the multiplicative inverse. Because when you multiply a number by its inverse, you get 1, which is the identity. Now, this next one, 3 plus 8 equals x plus 3. What does x equal? You can clearly see that x should be 8, and that right there is flipping the order. That is the commutative property. Next one, x times 4 equals 4. Right there, what do we multiply by a number and it doesn't change that number? X equals 1. That is the multiplicative identity. 3.1 plus x equals 3.1. X right there. What do we add to something where it doesn't change that number when we add it? X would be 0. That is the additive identity. Okay, additive identity, because if we add the identity to anything, it does not change it. Now, 1/3 times 3 equals x. That 3 cancels. When you multiply, you just get x equals 1, right? Because you have 3 over 3. That right there is your multiplicative identity, or it's actually also inverse too, depending on how you look at it. You can take a number and multiply by its inverse and you get the identity. Okay, so that right there is multiplicative identity is 1. Okay, and knowing that if you take a number and multiply by its inverse, you get the identity, you could also say it's the inverse property as well. And the last one, x plus 0 equals 8. X equals 8. That is the, not multiply, the additive identity. Because that's knowing if we add 0 to something, it doesn't change it. Okay, so right there are your examples. You got the notes. Go ahead and do the you-try problems, and we will go over them tomorrow.